Thank you. Hi, Claire. My name is Adam Feinberg. I'm working on development and local services. Before the break, we almost got into a discussion around culture and looking at the granular level of the two case studies, and actually with my limited familiarity with two of the case study countries, being Vietnam and Sri Lanka, I think there's something about the impact of political control, political systems, religion, family linkages, and development in those countries, regardless of all the skills training, direct foreign investment opportunities, etc., which is relating to culture and people's culture. If we look at Vietnam, the actual dynamism and enterprise within the family unit and within the community is absolutely phenomenal. And the way in which, in small holdings, they switch product according to what the market rate is, year by year, season by season, is just incredible. And clearly, political systems are a significant restraining factor. And also the family unit and the family ties and the way that we see that through the economic crisis recently, a lot of families, a lot of skilled professionals went back to the farm and the family. And so my question is, and that's a very different scenario in Sri Lanka, and they're both war-torn economies. There's been a lot of infrastructural development. There's a lot of religious impact and cultural impact and ethnic divisions there, which impact, again, on culture and the way people respond economically and their resilience. I'm just wondering what the panel, their view is on those things.
Thank you very much. In the back there, please, dear.
Hi, my name is Shemiam. I'm from Lawyers for African Development. My question is, one of the upcoming sectors in the last probably 2 to 5 years, particularly in East Africa and maybe Ghana, has been the oil and gas sector. And it has had a lot of promise and opportunity. But in the last year, given the plunge of the oil prices, most of the investors have pulled out. And there have also been wrangles in terms of land grabbing. So as the proverbial adage goes, is that a blessing or a curse? Thank you.
Okay, any more in this round, please? Just here in the front here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Ulla Baggio. I'm an independent consultant, and I was in Ghana last year looking exactly at these issues. And other things. Now, I just wondered, I haven't read the papers, so I'm just guessing, but putting employment at the center of economic transformation, if that's a question, it would be also nice to see it in context of human rights, where the state is sort of the overall promoter and guarantor of the Constitution, which includes employment, but certainly not only that. And that then moves into economic sectors. How do you use the economic sectors to provide public goods for everyone and look at it from a life cycle risk management point of view? What is necessary at the different areas in your life cycle and making social contracts and so on. So move it into that context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as I said, we're not shying away from the big questions here. We have the impact of family structure and culture on how people react to market signals and their role in sort of protection. Social protection. We have the resource curse, true or false, and we have human rights and economic development. So if either of you want to tackle any of those in a couple of minutes or so, that would be very welcome. Can I just say, we're going to have, I think, one more round of questions before the break, and I'm particularly interested, I mean, I know obviously you want to pick the brains of the experts that we have here on the panel, but I'm also really interested in the answers that you have here. There's a wealth of experience in this room, and if anyone would like to be a bit more propositional and suggest from your own experience some of the things that you think would work or ways of answering these questions, that would be very welcome too. But let me start with Bruce there.
Okay, so the easiest of the questions. The resource curse, I think maybe it's a little bit what we began to touch on, or what Rolf began to touch on, was it depends what you do with the resources. So if, for example, those resources that come from extractive sector can then be used to promote investment in industrialization, in infrastructures, etc., then obviously there's a way for that to avoid the curse. I guess it goes, I mean, unfortunately the final line is always the politics though, right? I mean, if you manage to have such a situation that political elites are obliged to, or the political elites see it in their own interest to invest in productive sectors, etc., then that's where you might have success. I guess the question then for policymakers and within the countries and elsewhere is, what can you do to adjust the interests of those political elites? And there, of course, these issues of transparency, etc., may have a role to play. But I think, I mean, obviously that's not an easy one to answer. The other one's not an easy one to answer either. But I guess there's a couple of cultural issues that came up in the Sri Lanka study that are quite interesting. I mean, certainly I wouldn't want to sort of start going down the path sort of cultural determinism or anything, but there's for sure the story in Sri Lanka, there's a kind of complex interaction between economic processes and structural adjustment and how that impacted on different ethnic groups, which then fed the conflict, so it was manipulated politically to feed the conflict, but then also the benefits, so the war economy also did have some benefits. So some of the employment progress that we talked about in the study, some of the fall in unemployment is actually to do with public sector employment, including the military. And maybe just on the family side of things, I mean, there's one of the sort of snippets that comes out of the Sri Lanka story also on migration and also on the garments factories is this story about the role of women within the family and how sort of how culturally they're able to deal with this. So there has been criticism and some garment sector employees being criticized for working in producing women's underwear. I mean, this is a story certainly in Sri Lanka. I think I've also heard that also from China. And there is a story about what the impact of these different dynamics is on the family structure almost as opposed to the opposite. I'm not sure if that answered your question in any way, but that's what the thoughts that were said.
Thank you. Yeah, first also the question on culture. I think it's a very important question. It lays back also to sociology. Max Weber, who explained capitalism on the basis of Protestantism. The countries where Protestant were the most capitalist countries. But I think if you look at all experience, we can also be a bit more critical of the concept of culture as a concept of development. And then I refer to a good friend of mine, Hyung Chang. I don't know if some of you have read his book. He has a famous passage of a country where people are lazy, they're drinking beer, their women are mistreated. And after 3 pages, then, yeah, I've seen that all. And then it appeared to be an 1870 description of Germany, which is now seen as the most effective country. So I think we should also place culture in relation to economic development, societal development. Culture is also not static. So culture is important, but there are also relations, and I don't think we can judge or put policy only on the basis of fixed cultural concept, because culture is very much changing. I think the resource curse, Bruce mentioned that already in good points. Transparency, what is done with the subject, and again here, international agreements play very much role. I know that some of the people in NGOs in Ghana have been very much looking to counterparts outside Ghana in order to help for transparency, etc., to refer to human rights issues, etc. So I think that's important. And then your question also on employment and human rights. In certain constitutions, indeed, employment is in the constitution, is a human right. They're also part of the economic and social cultural rights of the United Nations. Countries who are member of the International Labour Organization also have to report on what they do with employment. So there is indeed a very weak, soft law on the need for employment. But as all cases, it's the way how do you reinforce that. And that should also be, again, a combination of national and international issues of action. And one of the things is also to, for example, also what happened in Ghana, if government can be pushed to lock in their activities beyond parliamentary cycles. And one example of that is, for example, Norway is a country which had a lot of oil and gas. And they created the sovereign wealth funds, which is locked out of the governance system. And these are, and especially if that can be done in developing countries with international support, then you can use much more both the human rights instruments and the examples Bruce gave.
Thank you very much. Now, bearing in mind that this next round of questions is all that is standing between us and our lunch, would anybody please, gentleman over there, please introduce yourself and make it brief. Thank you.
My name is I'm an agricultural scientist. I just want to find out, because you mentioned in your concluding remark that agriculture and service sector will be one of the leading sectors that will contribute to growth in Africa. Most African countries are trying in one way or the other to diversify their economy. I'm from Nigeria, and Nigerian government have been places agriculture as one of the key sectors to drive the economy to diversify from the petroleum-based economy. What do you think African countries need to do that they are not already doing that will fast-track the development of to contribute to growth? Thank you.
Thank you. Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Nicolai from ODI, and I work with the Development Progress Project overall, and I just want to also thank Bruce and team for quite a lot of work and an excellent set of case studies and discussion. My comment or question, I guess, is it really strikes me that through all of the presentations, education and the how education needs to change and focus on skills, but also learning and relearning is absolutely central as we look forward for jobs for the future. But when one looks at international focus on education and engagement with education, it's often at the primary level, and part of that is shaped by what the MDGs have been. But I'm not sure that that one sees at the moment a real movement around this nexus of education and employment to be transformative, at least from the development community. And I guess just any thoughts or comments about what might be needed to have a greater focus on that?
Thank you. I think actually those two questions really exemplify the kind of what, to my mind at least, is the two big questions that have been posed here today. So my temptation is to stop there and I think, first of all, on the question of agriculture, I've been really struck throughout the morning, and whenever I read about this, that we have a sort of very odd attitude to agriculture in these discussions. On the one hand, we see economies where a very large number of people are employed in agriculture, where often it is quite a sizable sector of the economy, and we assume optimism. I think somebody said today, I think it's been said already today about the potential of agriculture and so on. And yet when we look at trends, what we see is declining productivity, declining share of employment, declining and sometimes negative contribution to GDP. So our sort of optimism about agriculture, we have a sort of stocks and flows view of agriculture which are wildly divergent. When we look at how things are, we see important. When we look at the trends, we see a less rosy picture. And I think, sort of understanding what agriculture, the role of agriculture, what it can contribute, and how to tackle policy in those areas and the linkages with other sectors and other areas of policy is a critical question confronting governments trying to make policy in this area. And secondly, education is one of the most obvious policy levers that governments can pull in this area. There aren't many, as we've heard, and yet education consistently comes up as a question, as a complaint by the private sector that governments are not doing adequately. And again, a sort of policy environment in this sector which is being pulled between lots of different demands, not always focused on the needs of employment and growth, at least not directly. So it feels to me in policy terms those are really two of the most critical issues that have been raised by the research that has been done in this morning's conversation. So I wonder if you could somehow combine both summing up and answering those two questions. Let me start with Ralph this time. Thank you.
I think you summed it up already, so I don't know why you want me to sum it
Sorry.
up. But I think the question from our friends from Nigeria, what should governments do, I think was already surfaced already in the earlier discussion. It's a much more proactive stance on, for example, in the case of Nigeria, what should happen with the oil surplus in Nigeria. Despite the falling oil prices, there's still a big surplus. And how is that surplus used for employment creation and in increasing productivity? And we have seen better examples. The worst example, of course, in Africa is Angola. If you see what's happening there, you really start to shiver, because where you have a huge extraction. And I think what developed countries, because they also can help, I think is to help the civil society and governments more mobile to work on the national resources, for example. It's in Africa. I had lunch last week with the Secretary General of the East African Economic Commission for Africa. And he said, actually, what I like from developed countries is now support in keeping the resources in Africa and helping us to use the resources in a big way. And then he talked about oil. He talked also about macro-financial issues. He said because of the volatility in the international world, governments have to have vast resources of foreign resources. Those foreign resources are laying in the Fed in New York. They cannot be used for investment. So how can we look at using better resources in order to achieve those productivity and employment challenges? And for him, that was one of his major planks of his activities in the coming 5 years. And then on education is always key, but it depends, of course, on what kind of education. And I agree with Susan that maybe there has been some disservice by the MDGs in respect to education, because it was only aiming at primary education. And actually a lot of countries had achieved already primary education, more or less. So they said, well, we're not bound by the MDGs anymore. So we are the good boys or girls, but they were not the good boys and girls because they didn't take. So I think the attention for education is resurfacing again. But it has to, of course, to be kind of different education, learning for change rather than learning for skills. Because we have seen where she gave a nice example of what's happening in the future trends, how unpredictable that is. In coffee talk I spoke to some colleagues. My children are now doing jobs of which when I was a student didn't know that they existed. So you cannot also build education systems to predict what 20 years later what kind of jobs you have. So you need to build much more flexibility and etc. in those issues. And I think the political pressure is coming up. But I want just to make one warning. Politicians always say, oh, education is the key to jobs. No, it's not the key to jobs. The key to jobs is the demand in the economy. Yeah. If there's no demand and no growth, then you can educate whatever you want, but you don't get jobs. So you have always to pull politicians. They like to say education, We have to bully, but where are the jobs? Not if an employed person can't find the jobs, we have problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Bruce.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah. Now you've rounded it up perfectly well as well. I think maybe on the on the story about services and agriculture being the future rather than industry, I think that's partly a reading of what's been happening. So a little bit what was discussed there is that services are the growth sector. That is where people are moving into. So it's if these countries were to go through an industrialization process, I think it's not to say that countries won't try, but it's also that conditions have changed. So there's this work, for example, by Richard Baldwin talking about the nature of global value chains now. You don't build value chains now, you join them, and which means that the benefits from being part of that are much more limited. And it also means that there's a whole bunch of different constraints and different challenges to overcome to do that. But there is a strategy that I'm quite interested in that kind of deals with some of these issues altogether. Is these sort of agricultural growth corridors that you hear about now more and more. In Tanzania they have, in Mozambique, and there's several others. And basically I think these are quite interesting because they kind of link all sorts of these different aspects that we're talking about here. Between infrastructure, between public investment, and between large commercial scale farms and smallholders, improving transport, improving access to electricity. So it's kind of like a targeted spatial approach, which to some degree helps you sort of overcome some of the original constraints in a smaller space, and maybe does allow you to get these linkages then between services, between access to inputs, and then sort of processing and investments as well. So that's maybe a sort of interesting one to think about in terms of how to kind of start focusing in and looking at some of the things that we're talking about today. On education, I have to confess this is not my strong point, but having worked a lot in private sector development and enterprise development, I think some of the interesting things that are coming out of recent literature are precisely these alternative forms of education, sort of capability building through grants to support management, sort of basic management techniques. As Bloom and colleagues have done some work where they're looking at how firms have responded to some minor assistance in terms of improving management skills. And basically firm productivity goes up quite a lot, and it then leads to this creation of jobs. So it's not training as such, it's not schooling as such, but it's kind of availability of this sort of broader basic management techniques. And these things have been happening at a limited level up to now. And of course, there's also sort of some of these experiments or randomized control trials and things going on now about sort of distinction between handing money to firms in order for them to employ, or giving that money to individuals and seeing what happens to them in terms of creating their own job. So I think there are some interesting pieces of work going on about trying to see where these different things fit in. But I mean, well, what everyone always talks about in these is scaling up, and to me that brings me back to what hopefully is the punchline to this whole day is the importance of the politics. That if you are not able to work within current incentives, then you have to find a way to alter the incentives, or if not, somehow cut through them. So there may be opportunities through ICT to sort of cut through some of these different loops. But ultimately, yeah, if we're looking at demand for jobs, then we need to find a way to work with governments to put in place those policies that are required. But so thank you very much for
Thank you.
the
Thank
opportunity
you
to be
to
here.
Bruce and Will for this panel. And let me also sing, as this is now the end of this session, thank Bruce again for leading this whole all of this research effort, which has gone the outcome of which you're seeing today, and also Laura from ODI, who worked closely with him on that. Let me also thank the rest of the team who were involved, Susan, the rest of the Development Progress team, Bruce's colleagues from ECDPM, and others who've worked so hard to make the research possible. Please go and look on the Development Progress website, where you'll see all of the papers, and some other, an animation and a forthcoming film, which is being, I think, put together pretty much as we speak.
We saw it already.
Okay, we saw it already. That was my fault for being late. My fault for being late this morning. And there'll be other events. What's the next Dimension launch scheduled? Urban poverty in May, again, very pertinent to a lot of the issues we've raised here. So thank you very much, and sandwiches are outside.
Thank you.